Somewhere inside a research facility in Germany, a quantum computer has been running continuously since June of last year. No dilution refrigerator, no liquid helium, no vacuum chamber cooled colder than the space between stars. It just sits there, at ordinary room temperature, in the same kind of environment as the laptop you're probably watching this on, quietly outperforming the specifications its own buyers wrote into the purchase contract. For decades, this was considered physically impossible. Quantum computers needed cold, brutal, expensive cold, or they simply stopped working. Read that again. This one didn't get the memo, and it's not alone anymore. To understand why this matters, and why so many labs around the world are suddenly racing toward the exact same finish line within months of each other, you need to understand the single ugliest, most expensive secret sitting at the heart of almost every quantum computer ever built. Qubits, the basic units of quantum information, are catastrophically fragile. When heat is their enemy, not in some poetic, abstract sense, but in a brutally literal, physical way. At room temperature, every atom inside a material is constantly jittering, vibrating, colliding with its neighbors, generating what physicists call thermal noise. For most types of qubits, that noise is loud enough to instantly wipe out the delicate quantum state the entire calculation depends on, the same way shouting into a phone during a hurricane would drown out the voice on the other end. The traditional solution has been almost absurdly extreme. Cool the entire system down to a fraction of a degree above absolute zero, colder than the vacuum of deep space, using something called a dilution refrigerator, a machine that can cost millions of dollars, fill an entire room, and consume enormous amounts of electricity just to keep a handful of fragile qubits quiet enough to actually compute with. This is not chaos. This is strategy, but it's a strategy that comes with a brutal price tag attached to every single quantum computer built this way, a price tag that has quietly kept this entire technology locked inside a small number of elite national laboratories and billion-dollar tech companies for the better part of 2 decades. What most people are not seeing is that an entirely different approach has been quietly maturing in parallel this whole time, one that doesn't fight the heat, doesn't try to freeze it into submission, but instead finds ways to build quantum systems that simply don't care about it in the first place. And in 2026, several completely independent research teams and startups working continents apart, using different underlying physics, different funding models, different national strategies, have all crossed the same finish line within months of each other. Room temperature quantum computing has stopped being a theoretical possibility discussed in physics journals and started showing up as an actual, purchasable, deployed piece of hardware, sitting inside real research facilities, running real workloads right now. Let's start with the company furthest along this particular path, because their story illustrates exactly how this breakthrough actually works at a physical level. Quantum Brilliance, founded back in 2019 as a spin-out from the Australian National University, took a genuinely different approach to the entire problem of building a qubit in the first place. Instead of trying to isolate a fragile quantum state and then wrap that state in millions of dollars of cooling infrastructure to protect it from heat, the company builds its qubits using something called nitrogen vacancy centers, tiny, deliberately engineered defects embedded inside synthetic diamond. Think about what a diamond actually is at the atomic level. An incredibly rigid, incredibly stable lattice of carbon atoms locked together under enormous natural pressure. By deliberately removing a single carbon atom from that lattice and replacing its neighbor with a nitrogen atom, physicists create a tiny pocket inside the diamond's crystal structure where a quantum state can exist, protected not by extreme cold, but by the sheer physical rigidity of the diamond itself. According to Andrea Tabacchini, Quantum Brilliance's VP of Product and Marketing, this architecture gives the resulting qubits something genuinely rare in this field. It means we have long enough coherence time, so long enough usability of the qubit, even without the need of cooling down, he explained. Read that again, because it's the single sentence that undoes decades of assumed physical necessity in this entire industry. The diamond itself does the job that a multi-million-dollar refrigerator used to have to do. This isn't a laboratory curiosity anymore either. In late 2025, Quantum Brilliance deployed a small cluster of 3 of these quantum computers directly inside Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of the United States Department of Energy's flagship research facilities, housed in a rack that, according to the lab's own description, looks remarkably similar to an ordinary data center server rack. This is precisely the detail that should make you sit up, because it represents a genuine physical proof of concept for an idea the industry has been chasing for years, the possibility of racking quantum hardware directly alongside classical computing infrastructure in the same room without a dedicated cryogenic facility standing between them. Oak Ridge's own Leadership Computing Facility Program Director, Ashley Barker, described the goal of this partnership in strikingly practical terms, focused on co-scheduling end-to-end performance tuning, data and workflow orchestration, workforce development, and more. all aimed, in her words, at eventually moving HPC quantum integration from a conceptual pilot to a fully embedded capability within leadership computing. Notice what's missing from that description. No mention of building new cooling infrastructure, no mention of a separate isolated facility, just the ordinary, unglamorous engineering work of getting two different kinds of computer to talk to each other, exactly the kind of problem you'd expect to solve if the cooling problem had already been taken off the table entirely. Before we go further, though, this story deserves the same honest, careful scrutiny we bring to every claim on this channel. Because getting excited about a genuine breakthrough shouldn't mean glossing over what it doesn't yet solve. Tabachini himself was refreshingly direct about exactly where his company's technology still falls short of full commercial readiness. Solving the temperature problem, it turns out, is not the same thing as solving quantum computing's other equally stubborn challenge, the problem of noise and error correction. A fault-tolerant quantum computer is really what one needs for a genuine commercial scale operation, Tabachini explained, and even quantum brilliance's room temperature stable qubits remain subject to other forms of quantum noise beyond simple thermal vibration. Even a perfect quantum computer is still subject to noise, he said, and building the kind of quantum error correction algorithms needed to cut through that remaining noise and create a truly fault-tolerant machine is, in his own words, going to take a while. This is not chaos, this is honest science, the kind that earns long-term trust rather than a single viral headline. In the meantime, rather than overselling a fully mature, general-purpose quantum computer that doesn't exist yet, Quantum Brilliance is commercializing a genuinely useful near-term application of its diamond-based technology, high-resolution quantum magnetometry, essentially using these room temperature qubits as extraordinarily sensitive magnetic field detectors for industrial, transportation, and healthcare applications. A smaller but real revenue stream while the harder, longer-term computing problem continues to get solved. Quantum Brilliance isn't operating alone in this space, though, and here's where the story becomes genuinely global, spanning 3 separate continents, pursuing 3 distinct technical approaches to the exact same underlying goal. In Germany, a startup called Saxon Q made a striking announcement in July of 2026, launching 2 commercial systems, the SXQ128 and the SQ512, capable of scaling up to 128 and 512 qubits, respectively. According to the company's own materials, these represent the first quantum computers based on diamond nitrogen vacancy centers to break meaningfully past the 10-qubit mark while operating entirely at room temperature, with no cryogenic cooling, no vacuum equipment, and no specialized facility required whatsoever. Think about the significance of that qubit count for a moment. 10 qubits is a laboratory demonstration. 128, scaling toward 512, starts to look like genuinely useful computational hardware, and doing it entirely at room temperature represents a substantial engineering leap beyond earlier proof-of-concept diamond systems. And this isn't a theoretical claim sitting in a press release somewhere either. A respected German applied research institute called Fraunhofer IAWU has actually been running one of Saxon Q's mobile quantum computing systems in a real industrial setting since June of 2025, using it for optimization problems in material processing and robotics. Albrecht Hennel, head of digital production twin at Fraunhofer IWU, offered a genuinely remarkable piece of independent, real-world validation. The system has operated at room temperature continuously since installation, he said, and has exceeded the gate fidelity specifications we outlined in the tender. Read that again, slowly, because it's an unusually strong endorsement in a field that's often full of cautious hedging and carefully qualified language. Not met expectations, exceeded them. A real customer, running a real industrial optimization workload on a room temperature quantum computer continuously for over a year, with performance that beat the numbers they'd specifically written into their own purchasing contract before installation. Here, over the past 9 months, has been genuinely rapid, almost startling in its pace. In October of 2025, a company called Zhongke Yuan, affiliated with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, delivered a system called Hanyuan-1 to a subsidiary of China Mobile, marking the very first commercial neutral atom quantum deployment anywhere inside China. The specifications behind Hanyuan-1 are genuinely impressive on their own technical merits. 100 qubits, operating entirely at room temperature, the whole system fitting inside just 3 standard equipment racks, with single qubit gate fidelity of 99.9% and 2 qubit gate fidelity of 98%. Numbers that hold up favorably against systems built using far more expensive, far more cumbersome cryogenic architectures. This wasn't a one-off government showcase either. The system generated real commercial traction, securing roughly 40 million yuan, approximately $5.6 million, in actual customer orders, including an international sale to Pakistan, specifically for the establishment of that country's first national quantum computing center. By December of 2025, Zhongke Kuyuan had secured strategic financing from the China Mobile Chain Leader Fund, the kind of institutional backing that signals genuine, sustained commercial confidence rather than a one-time publicity stunt. China's momentum in this specific corner of quantum computing didn't slow down after that first deployment either. Just 7 months later, in May of 2026, the same research lineage unveiled Hanyuan 2, a dual-core cabinet design built around a standard integrated cabinet-style architecture that explicitly requires no ultra-low temperature cooling environment whatsoever. With total power consumption held below 7 kilowatts, roughly comparable to running a handful of ordinary household electric ovens simultaneously, an almost absurdly modest energy footprint for a working quantum computer. And then, just 2 months after that, an entirely new competitor entered the field. At the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai in the summer of 2026, a startup called Zhongqi Wuliang, a spin-off from the Chinese Academy of Sciences Shanghai Institute of Optics and Fine Mechanics that, according to industry reporting, simply did not exist a year earlier, unveiled a system called Qinghe No. 1. The pitch was strikingly direct and immediately understandable to anyone who's ever worked inside an ordinary data center. A quantum computer built to slide directly into a standard server rack, with no dilution refrigerator, no vibration isolation table, and no dedicated quantum facility required at all. Here's the honest caveat. This specific claim deserves, though, the kind of careful skepticism that separates a documentary you can trust from one simply repeating a press release. As of the most recent available reporting, no independent benchmarks have yet been published verifying Qinghe No. 1's actual performance, unlike Hanyuan 1's already established, independently referenced fidelity numbers. A brand new company's own claims about a device unveiled at a trade show deserve real scrutiny before you take them as settled fact. And that scrutiny simply hasn't happened yet for this particular machine. There's a deeper, more foundational scientific thread running underneath all of these commercial announcements, one that helps explain why this entire category of breakthrough is happening simultaneously across so many different labs and companies right now, rather than emerging from a single isolated research group. At Stanford University, researchers demonstrated something genuinely remarkable at the most fundamental level of physics itself: room temperature entanglement between a single photon of light and a single electron, achieved directly on a silicon-compatible chip. The team accomplished this using an elegant combination of what physicists call twisted light, a two-dimensional material called molybdenum diselenide, something known as Valley states, and carefully engineered silicon nanostructures, working together to create genuinely stable quantum interactions without any dilution refrigerator involved at any point in the process. It's worth being precise and honest about exactly what this result represents, because overselling it would do a disservice to genuinely exciting science. This is not, in itself, a full working quantum computer. It's something arguably more foundational than that, a demonstration that one of the core physical phenomena quantum computers depend on, entanglement itself, the strange linking of two particles' quantum states across space, can be reliably created and maintained at ordinary room temperature on a chip built using silicon-compatible manufacturing techniques the existing semiconductor industry already knows how to work with. Think about the implications buried inside that specific detail. If the fundamental building blocks of quantum information can be reliably created using silicon-compatible processes, the eventual path toward manufacturing quantum hardware at genuine industrial scale starts to look a lot more like extending the classical chip industry's existing playbook, rather than inventing an entirely new manufacturing paradigm from scratch. A closely related discovery emerged just weeks later, adding yet another independent data point to this rapidly accumulating body of evidence. Physicists created what they're describing as the first genuinely room temperature quantum material, a plasmonic structure they call a quantum statistical metacrystal, built from gold metaatoms arranged with extraordinary precision directly onto a chip. This material operates at ordinary room temperature while selectively transmitting and routing distinct quantum states of light, functioning essentially as a quantum statistical filter, preserving quantum coherence and enabling robust transport of quantum information without any cryogenic cooling whatsoever. To understand why this matters, you need to understand just how unusual this achievement actually is within the broader landscape of quantum materials science. Nearly every known quantum material discovered up to this point exhibits its most useful, most remarkable properties only when cooled to temperatures approaching absolute zero, because at room temperature, the constant thermal vibration of atoms simply overwhelms the delicate quantum behavior scientists are trying to harness and control. This new metacrystal appears to sidestep that entire problem through its underlying geometric design rather than through brute force cooling. And the research team behind it frames their work as supplying a general design principle for engineered quantum materials going forward, with potential applications reaching beyond quantum computing entirely into fields like quantum information processing and even improved solar energy conversion technology. Stepping back from any single one of these individual breakthroughs, a genuinely striking pattern starts to emerge once you lay them all out side by side on the same timeline. An Australian-founded company perfecting diamond-based qubits and deploying them at a U.S. national laboratory. Before this list climbs into its final and most consequential entries, it's worth pulling back, because none of these individual lab breakthroughs happened in isolation. They're all pieces of an enormous, deliberately coordinated national research push. According to patent tracking cited in telecom industry reporting, the overwhelming majority of China's 6G-related patent applications are specifically concentrated in mobile infrastructure technology, the unglamorous but foundational layer of towers, chips, and signal processing that any working network actually depends on, rather than flashy consumer-facing features. Here's the thing that makes that concentration significant once you sit with it. China has systematically led the world in 5G-related technology patents for years, and telecom analysts tracking the current 6G research landscape note that multiple separate Chinese teams, Purple Mountain Laboratories, China Mobile, Southeast University, Fudan University, and joint Hong Kong-Beijing research groups are all independently pushing forward on overlapping pieces of the same underlying 6G puzzle simultaneously, backed by dedicated government research funding specifically targeting undefined, not yet standardized 6G systems. This is not one lucky lab stumbling onto a single breakthrough. Across almost the entire usable wireless spectrum, and a trial network already reporting speeds Chinese researchers describe as a full terabit per second. Stop looking like isolated lab curiosities and start looking like exactly what they are. The leading edge of a national program explicitly trying to own the next generation of wireless communication before international standards for it have even been finalized. Number 2 is the ultra-wideband full-spectrum chip developed by a joint Hong Kong-Beijing research team. And it earns this position because it solves one of the most practical, unglamorous problems standing between today's lab demonstrations and any real commercial 6G device ever reaching an ordinary consumer. Here's the backstory. Announced by the joint team, this chip project tackled a challenge that had quietly limited how useful all the raw speed records covered so far actually are. Every different frequency band typically requires its own dedicated hardware to transmit and receive on, meaning a single device trying to communicate across multiple bands has historically needed multiple separate radio chips stacked together, adding cost, size, and power consumption. Here's the mechanism that makes this chip genuinely significant. The team successfully tested ultra-wideband technology capable of delivering high-speed, tunable transmission across virtually any frequency between 0.5 gigahertz and 115 gigahertz, meaning a single piece of silicon can now dynamically retune itself to operate across an enormous span of the usable wireless spectrum, rather than being permanently locked to one narrow slice of it. Here's the number that shows this isn't just a flexibility trick with no real performance behind it. The system is capable of achieving data downlinks exceeding 100 gigabits per second, officially reported alongside the frequency range breakthrough, meaning this chip doesn't sacrifice raw speed in exchange for its dramatically wider tuning range. Think about what that combination actually unlocks. For the future of device design, if this technology can be scaled into commercial manufacturing, it could massively simplify how future 6G devices are built, letting a single chip replace what would otherwise require several separate band-specific radio components, directly reducing the cost, size, and complexity of building an actual 6G-capable phone or router. Here's the honest caveat worth including here, because credibility matters more than hype. This remains, as of the most recent reporting, a successfully tested research breakthrough, rather than a chip already sitting inside a mass-manufactured commercial product. And the real test of its significance will be whether it can actually be scaled into affordable, reliable manufacturing, rather than staying confined to a research lab. But even a genuinely flexible high-speed chip is still, fundamentally, a single component. The final entry on this list is where several of these separate breakthroughs started coming together inside one functioning trial network. Number 1 is the 6G terahertz trial network built and tested in Huairu, near Beijing, and it takes the top spot on this list because, according to the researchers behind it, this wasn't just another isolated speed record inside a shielded lab room. It was described as the world's first 6G terahertz trial network, an actual functioning system rather than a single point-to-point demonstration. Here's the mechanism that makes a trial network fundamentally more significant than a single speed test. Unlike the earlier entries on this list, which each demonstrated one specific capability, raw speed, long distance, satellite-oriented design, or flexible hardware, a trial network has to keep a signal stable, manage interference, and maintain a usable connection continuously over time, the exact kind of sustained real-world performance that ultimately determines whether a laboratory breakthrough can ever become an actual deployed communication standard. Here's the number that puts this entry at the very top of this list. Researchers reported achieving ultra-low latency alongside a peak downlink, speed of approximately 1 terabit per second, a full trillion bits of data every single second, comparable to downloading several complete high-definition movies in a fraction of a heartbeat, and roughly 100 times faster than the peak theoretical speeds most current 5G networks are capable of delivering. Think about what a genuine terabit per second trial network actually represents when you stack it against everything else on this list. This is the first entry where multiple separate threads of China's 6G research, terahertz transmission, low latency signal processing, sustained network stability, appear to be functioning together inside one coordinated system, rather than as isolated individual achievements. Here's the honest concession worth ending on, because it comes from controlled test conditions rather than a live, publicly available commercial network that an ordinary person could actually connect to today. That is exactly why it's here at number 1. It isn't proof that 6G is already here. It's the clearest evidence yet of exactly which country's research institutions are furthest along in building it. So here's the full picture, start to finish. Purple Mountain Laboratories' original terahertz speed record first proved that transmitting real data on this frequency band was even genuinely possible outside a physics textbook. The Qinghai-Zhejiang Plateau experiment then solved the distance problem, using superconducting receivers to stretch a usable signal across more than a kilometer at an almost unbelievably low power level. China's terahertz space communication system took that same underlying science and pointed it directly at satellites and long-range applications instead of ground-based links. The Hong Kong-Beijing ultra-wideband chip solved the hardware problem, proving a single piece of silicon could someday replace the tangle of separate radio components future 6G devices would otherwise need. And the Huairou trial network pulled several of those separate breakthroughs together into an actual functioning system, reporting speeds researchers describe as approaching a full terabit per second. What you're actually watching across this entire list is the same shift that happened during the early years of 5G research a decade ago. A scattered collection of individual laboratory speed, records slowly converging into an actual coordinated technology roadmap, years before any consumer ever held a device capable of using it. China didn't win the 5G patent race by accident, and every single entry on this list suggests the country's research institutions are running that exact same playbook again, earlier and more aggressively than most of the rest of the world has even started. If breakdowns like this, and the real research and the real numbers behind China's biggest telecom pushes, are useful to you, hit like and subscribe. Because there's more of this coming, including a closer look at what happens once international standards bodies actually sit down and decide what 6G is officially allowed to look like. So here's the honest question for the comments. Does a trillion bits per second trial network genuinely excite you about what your phone might do a decade from now? Or does the fact that none of this is remotely close to your actual pocket, yet make it feel more like a headline than a real breakthrough? I rate every single one.